Texas sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange, casting long, stretching shadows across the wooden planks of the ranch porch. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and cooling earth, the kind of silence you could wrap around your shoulders like a warm blanket. A single rocking chair creaked rhythmically, back and forth, a metronome for a life well lived. It was the only place in the world where the noise stopped. It was the only place where George Strait felt like a man, not a monument, but that image, that perfect moment of solitude on the porch at sunset, was 1,000 miles away. It was a memory fading rapidly against the harsh, blinding reality of the present moment. Snap back to reality. The silence of the ranch was shattered by the deafening roar of 60,000 people screaming in unison. The smell of sagebrush was replaced by the stinging scent of pyrotechnics, stale beer, and industrial air conditioning. This was the Neon Arena in Las Vegas, a cathedral of glass and steel built to worship excess. And standing in the center of it all, feeling more like a museum exhibit than a human being, was the king of country himself. George Strait adjusted his hat, the felt brim casting a shadow over eyes that had seen decades of highways and honky-tonks. He gripped the neck of his guitar, his calloused fingers finding the familiar grooves of the fretboard, but his heart wasn't in the rhythm. Not tonight. Tonight, the machinery of the industry felt heavier than usual. Backstage, in a control room that looked more like the bridge of a spaceship than a concert venue, Tyler Vance was screaming into a headset. Tyler was 32 years old, wore a suit that cost more than George's first truck, and had eyes that never blinked, constantly scanning 3 different monitors of real-time analytics. He didn't care about the music. He didn't know the difference between a fiddle and a violin, and he certainly didn't care about the soul of a cowboy. To Tyler Vance, George Strait was an asset, a high-yield bond with a cowboy hat. "We need more engagement on the live streams," Tyler barked, his voice cutting through the chaotic chatter of the production team. "The graph is plateauing. The demographic in the 18 to 24 range is dropping off. We need the interactive segment now. Tell the old man to wrap up the ballad and move to the center stage. We are doing the social media read. Now." On stage, George finished the last note of a song that had made millions of people fall in love or cry over a broken heart. The applause was a physical force, a wall of sound that hit him in the chest. He smiled, that crooked, genuine smile that had charmed the world for 40 years, but behind it, he was tired. He tapped the earpiece in his right ear, wincing as the high-pitched voice of the producer cut through his thoughts. "George, listen to me." Tyler's voice buzzed, devoid of respect. "Cut the applause. We are behind schedule. Move to the center marker. The tablet is rising on the hydraulic lift. Remember the briefing, 3 tweets, read them, laugh, thank the sponsors, and move on. Do not improvise, we have global sponsors watching. Keep it clean, keep it fast." George sighed, a sound lost in the roar of the crowd. He walked slowly to the center of the stage. He moved with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life on horses, not rushing, never rushing. A sleek, futuristic pedestal rose from the floor, holding a glowing digital tablet. It looked alien against his pearl snap shirt and silver belt buckle. This was the new world, the world where music wasn't enough. You had to be a content creator. You had to be viral. "Ladies and gentlemen," George spoke into the microphone, his voice deep and steady, grounding the frenetic energy of the room. "They tell me we got some folks watching from all over the world tonight, and they tell me I'm supposed to read some of your messages on this little computer screen here." The crowd cheered, holding up their phones, thousands of tiny lights looking like fireflies in a steel canyon. In the control room, Tyler Vance leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the desk. "Okay, filter team. Stay sharp," Tyler ordered. "I want only the approved messages. I love your hat. Best concert ever. Marry me, George. Keep it fluffy. Keep it positive. If I see one negative comment or one sob story, I will fire everyone in this room." On the stage, George looked down at the screen. The text was large, scrolling slowly. It was exactly what Tyler wanted. "Sarah from Ohio says, 'George, you are the soundtrack of my life.' Mike from Texas says, 'Nobody does it like the king.'" George read them, his voice flat. He felt like a carnival barker. He hated this. He hated the artificial barrier it put between him and the people. He looked out into the darkness, trying to see the faces in the front row, trying to find a human connection amidst the spectacle. And then, it happened. A flicker on the screen. A stutter in the digital feed. Maybe it was a hacker. Maybe it was a power surge in the complex server farm beneath the arena. Maybe it was just fate, tired of the lies. The smooth, curated list of compliments vanished. The screen turned black for a millisecond, and then text began to scroll. Fast, raw, unfiltered. This wasn't the PR-approved feed. This was the fire hose of the internet. This was the real voice of the people, unleashed without a gatekeeper. George squinted. The words were moving so fast he could barely catch them, but he saw flashes of reality that the producers had tried desperately to hide. He saw anger. He saw loneliness. My husband beat me again tonight. Listening to your music is the only safe place I have. I lost the farm, George. 3 generations. Gone. I don't know what to do. Why does the ticket cost $300? I can't feed my kids. In the control room, chaos erupted. Tyler Vance slammed his fist onto the console. Cut it. Cut the feed. Who turned off the filter? Kill the screen. But the screen didn't die. It seemed to lock up, freezing on a block of text, refusing to refresh. On stage, George stopped reading the script. He stopped smiling. The showbiz mask fell away, revealing the face of a man who had known hard work and hard times. He leaned in closer to the tablet, ignoring the blinding spotlight hitting him from above. "George!" Tyler screamed in his ear, the volume so loud George flinched. "Ignore the screen. Look up. Look at the camera. We are cutting to a commercial. Do not read that." But George Strait wasn't listening to the voice in his ear anymore. He was reading. His eyes, usually crinkled with laughter, grew wide with a profound, sinking sorrow. He read the message that had frozen on the screen, a message that had somehow fought its way through the firewalls and the algorithms to find him in the middle of this neon ocean. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and touched the screen, as if trying to comfort the glass. The band, sensing the shift, continued to play a soft instrumental loop, waiting for the cue that wasn't coming. The 60,000 people in the arena sensed it too. The cheering died down, replaced by a confused murmur. Why was he stopping? Why did he look so stricken? In the earpiece, Tyler Vance was hyperventilating. "I swear to God, George, if you read that trash, I will sue you for breach of contract. I will bury you in litigation. Walk away from the pedestal." George slowly raised his hand to his ear. With a deliberate, heavy motion, he pulled the earpiece out. The tiny device dangled by its wire against his shirt. He let it drop. The silence that followed in his head was the first moment of peace he had felt all day. He looked at the camera, the main broadcast camera that was beaming this signal to millions of homes. He didn't look like a star. He looked like a father. He looked like a neighbor. "Turn the music off," George said. His voice wasn't shouted. It was a low rumble, but it carried such authority that the drummer immediately grabbed his cymbals to stop their vibration. The bass player muted his strings. The silence in the neon arena was sudden and terrifying. It was the sound of a massive machine grinding to a halt. George picked up the microphone. He didn't use his stage voice. He used the voice he used on the ranch porch at sunset. "They want me to read you some happy messages," George said, gesturing vaguely to the back of the arena where the executives sat in their glass boxes. "They want me to pretend that everything is fine, that we're all just here to party and forget." He looked back down at the tablet. "But I can't do that, not after seeing this." Backstage, Tyler Vance was screaming at the technical director. "Cut his mic! Cut the house audio! Go to black!" "Sir, we can't," the sound engineer stammered, his hands hovering over the mixing board. "The system is locked out. The same glitch that hit the tablet is affecting the main board. We can't mute him unless we kill the main power to the building." "Then kill the power!" Tyler shrieked, his face turning purple. "Don't you dare!" A large man in a security uniform stepped forward, blocking the producer from the power panel. "That man on stage is talking. You let him talk." On stage, George took a deep breath. The air conditioning hummed. A woman in the front row was crying, though she didn't know why yet. She just felt the weight of the moment. "This message," George started, his voice cracking slightly. "It ain't about how much you like my hat. It's from a young woman named Sarah." He paused, looking at the words burnt into the pixels of the screen. "She says, 'George, my name is Sarah. I'm at the St. Jude's Hospital unit in Nashville. My daddy is a Vietnam veteran. He was a jagged, hard man, but he loved 2 things, this country and your music. He lost the farm in the drought of '82. He lost his wife to cancer last year. Now, he's losing his battle. The doctors say he has minutes, maybe an hour. He's holding my hand right now, and he's scared, George. He's never been scared of anything, not bullets, not bulls, but he's scared to die in the dark." George stopped. He had to wipe his eye with the back of his hand. The arena was so quiet, you could hear the heartbeat of the person standing next to you. She says, "He told me once that he met you in a bar in San Antonio, way back before you were the king. He said he was broke, and you bought him a beer and told him to keep his head up. He's asking for you, George. He just wants to hear the cowboy rides away one last time, please. He's fading." George looked up from the screen. His eyes were wet, blazing with an intensity that terrified the corporate suits in the back. Tyler Vance was slumped in his chair, defeated by the raw humanity of the moment, but still calculating the damage. "This is a disaster," he whispered. "This is too depressing. People tune in to escape death, not to watch it." George gripped the microphone stand. He didn't look at the set list taped to the floor. He didn't look at the clock. "I don't know if you can hear me, Sarah," George said, his voice booming through the massive speakers, reaching every corner of the arena, every living room watching the broadcast. "And I don't know if your daddy is still with us, but in Texas we don't let a cowboy ride out alone." He turned to the band leader. The musicians were stunned, waiting. George didn't ask for a key. He didn't ask for a tempo. He just turned back to the crowd. "I need a phone," George demanded. The request confused everyone. "I need a phone," George repeated, louder this time. "Somebody get me a phone connected to the sound system. Right now." A stagehand, a young kid with terrified eyes, ran out from the wings holding a mobile phone that was plugged into the interface box for emergency playback. He handed it to George with shaking hands. "Is this live?" George asked. "Yes, sir," the kid squeaked. George looked at the tablet again. The number was there, buried in the text of the desperate message. He dialed it. The sound of the keypad tones, beep, 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 echoed through the massive stadium speakers. It was a surreal sound, intimate and mechanical at the same time. The ringback tone purred. 1 ring, 2 rings. The tension in the arena was unbearable. 60,000 people held their breath. Was it too late? Was the man already gone? Was this all a cruel joke? On the 3rd ring, a click. "Hello?" a voice answered. It was a woman's voice, trembling, thick with tears. It was a whisper, as if she was in a place where loud noises were forbidden. "Sarah?" George asked. There was a gasp on the other end of the line. The sound of it was amplified 10,000 times, filling the neon arena. Who is this?" "It's George, darling. George Strait." A sob broke through the speakers, a sound so raw and painful that it made the hair on the arms of everyone in the audience stand up. Even Tyler Vance in his cold control room stopped typing. "Oh my God," Sarah cried. "Oh my God, he's barely breathing, George. He's right here." "Put the phone to his ear, Sarah," George said softly. "Do it now." There was a rustling sound, the friction of the phone moving against fabric and skin. Then a different sound, a ragged, wet, rattling breath, the sound of a man fighting for one last sip of air. It was the sound of death, broadcast live to the world. It was uncomfortable. It was terrifying. And it was the most real thing that had ever happened in that building. George closed his eyes. He forgot the cameras. He forgot the sponsors. He forgot the producer who wanted to sue him. He traveled back in his mind. He went back to that porch at sunset. He went back to the honky-tonks of 1982. He summoned every ounce of dignity and grace he possessed. He didn't signal the band. He didn't want drums. He didn't want piano. He opened his mouth and began to sing. A cappella. The last goodbye's the hardest one to say. This is where the cowboy rides away. His voice wasn't the polished, auto-tuned perfection of the radio. It was gravel and velvet. It cracked slightly on the high notes, heavy with emotion. It was a lullaby for a dying soldier. As he sang, the camera zoomed in on his face. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, unashamed. He wasn't performing. He was praying. He was guiding a soul home. Through the speakers, over the sound of George's voice, the ragged breathing on the phone line seemed to slow down. It became less of a struggle. The rhythm of the breath synchronized with the rhythm of the song. The crowd in the arena was weeping. Burly men in trucker hats wiped their eyes. Women held each other. The barrier between the star and the fan had been obliterated. There was only the room, the song, and the man dying in Nashville. George reached the chorus, his voice soaring, filling the void with a golden light of melody. "And my heart is sinking like the setting sun. Setting on the things I wish I'd done. He held the note, letting it hang in the air, a bridge between life and death. And then, just as he finished the line, the breathing on the phone stopped. It didn't stop violently. It just ceased. A long, final exhale, like a tire letting out its last bit of air, followed by absolute silence. George stopped singing. He stood there, the microphone gripped tight in his hand, the phone pressed to the mic. "Sarah," he whispered. Silence. Then, a soft voice. Calm now. Strangely peaceful. "He's gone, George." The words hung in the air. "He smiled," Sarah said, her voice gaining a little strength. "When you hit the chorus," he squeezed my hand, and he smiled. "He's gone." George lowered his head. His hat hid his face. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Go with God, soldier," George whispered into the phone. He didn't hang up. He waited until Sarah disconnected the call. The click of the line going dead was like a gunshot. The arena was silent. No one clapped. No one cheered. It felt wrong to make noise. They had just witnessed a soul leaving the earth. George handed the phone back to the stagehand, who was openly weeping. Then George turned to the camera. He looked straight into the lens, straight at Tyler Vance, straight at the world. "That's the show," he said. He didn't sing another song. He didn't do an encore. He took off his guitar and set it on the stand. He took his hat off, placed it over his heart for a brief second, and then turned and walked off the stage. The house lights were still down. The feed was still live. In the control room, Tyler Vance was paralyzed. The screen showing the analytics was flashing red, but not because the numbers were dropping. They were exploding. The engagement was vertical. The entire world was watching. But Tyler knew with a sinking dread in his gut that he had just lost control of everything. George Strait walked down the concrete hallway of the backstage area. His boots clicked on the floor. He ignored the assistants running toward him with water bottles and towels. He ignored the frantic waving of the executives. He walked straight to the exit door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the Las Vegas night. The air was hot and smelled of exhaust, but it was outside. He looked up at the sky. You couldn't see the stars here, not with all the neon, but he knew they were there. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. He dialed his pilot. "Get the plane ready," George said. "I'm going home." But the story wasn't over. As George stood there waiting for his ride, the back door of the arena burst open. Tyler Vance came running out, his tie undone, his face flushed with panic and rage. "You can't just leave," Tyler screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the legend. "We have a contract. We have 20 minutes of airtime left. You just cost this network millions of dollars. You walked off. You ruined the show." George turned slowly. He looked at Tyler not with anger but with pity. A deep, profound pity for a man who could watch a death and worry about a contract. "Son," George said, his voice low and dangerous like a rumbling thunderstorm, "I didn't ruin the show. I just gave you the only real thing you've ever broadcast." Tyler sputtered, stepping closer, invading George's space. "I will sue you for everything you have. I will make sure you never play a stadium again." George stepped forward. He towered over the producer. He didn't raise a fist. He just projected an aura of absolute, unshakable integrity. "You do what you gotta do," George said. "But if you ever try to stop a man from saying goodbye to his family again, me and you are gonna have a problem that lawyers can't fix." Tyler froze. He looked into George's eyes and saw something primal. He saw the Texas heat. He saw the iron will of a cowboy. And for the first time in his life, Tyler Vance was terrified. Just then, George's truck pulled up. A black dually, engine idling with a deep growl. George opened the door. Before he got in, he looked back at the producer. "Send the check for tonight's performance to that girl in Nashville," George said. "All of it. Or I will tell the world exactly what you said in my ear while that man was dying." George slammed the door. The truck peeled away, leaving Tyler Vance standing alone in the alleyway, surrounded by trash cans and the distant, confused noise of a stadium that didn't know how to go home. But as George drove away, heading toward the airport, his phone buzzed. It wasn't a text. It was a notification, a news alert. George Strait halts concert for dying veteran, the moment that stopped the world. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. He didn't care about the news. He cared about the silence. He cared about the fact that somewhere in the darkness, a cowboy had ridden away, and he hadn't done it alone. However, back at the arena, the crowd wasn't leaving. They were standing. And slowly, a sound began to rise. Not a boo, Not a cheer, but a song. 60,000 people, in the absence of the singer, began to sing the chorus of "The Cowboy Rides Away." It started as a murmur and grew into a hymn. Tyler Vance heard it from the alley. It was the sound of his career ending. But for George, speeding down the highway, it was just the wind. But the night was far from over. As George sat on his plane, staring out at the black void of the desert, his personal assistant, a loyal woman named Clara, who had been with him for 30 years, approached him with a pale face. "George," she whispered. "What is it, Clara?" "It's the girl, Sarah. She just called back on the production line. She didn't hang up when we thought she did. She heard the producer yelling at you." George sat up straighter. And she recorded it, George. She recorded everything Tyler said, and she just posted it." George looked out the window. The lights of Vegas were fading behind him. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Gulfstream jet cut through the obsidian sky at 40,000 feet, a silver needle stitching the distance between the plastic chaos of Nevada and the limestone soul of Texas. Inside the cabin, the air was pressurized and cool, humming with the monotonous drone of the engines. George Strait sat in a leather armchair that faced the window, staring out into the absolute darkness. A glass of water sat untouched on the mahogany table beside him. He hadn't spoken a word since the truck door slammed shut in Las Vegas. His hat rested on the seat opposite him, looking like a weary companion that had seen too much battle for one night. Clara, his assistant of 3 decades, sat across the aisle. She held her tablet with white-knuckled tension, the blue light from the screen illuminating her face in a ghostly pallor. She swiped, tapped, and swiped again, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror. She knew George wanted silence. She knew he needed to decompress from the spiritual weight of guiding a man to his death, but she also knew that the storm they had left behind on the ground was moving faster than the plane. "George," Clara whispered. The word hung in the cabin air, fragile. George didn't turn his head. His eyes were fixed on a distant star. "Let it be, Clara. Whatever they're saying, let them say it. I did what I had to do." "It's not what they are saying about you, George," Clara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and protective instinct. "It's what Tyler Vance is doing right now. You need to see this." George slowly turned his head. The fatigue in his eyes was profound, the look of a man who had carried the torch of a genre for so long that his shoulders were permanently braced against the weight. He reached out his hand. Clara placed the tablet in his palm. It was a video clip. Shaky, vertical, filmed from a low angle, likely a phone hidden in a pocket or propped against a console. The timestamp was from 40 minutes ago. The location, the control booth of the Neon Arena. On the screen, Tyler Vance was pacing like a caged animal, his face distorted with rage. The audio was crisp, cutting through the background noise of the concert. "I don't care if he's dying," Tyler's voice screamed from the tablet's tiny speakers. "I don't care if he's a war hero. He is a demographic statistic. He is a zero-income viewer. We are losing the 18 to 30 bracket because George decides to turn this into a funeral home. Cut the feed. Cut the mic. That old dinosaur is ruining my metrics." The video continued. A technician's voice could be heard asking about the morality of cutting off a dying man's last wish. Tyler's response on the video was chilling. "Morality doesn't pay for the lights, you idiot. If that old man dies on my airtime, I will sue his estate for depressing my audience. Get that trash off the screen." George watched the video. He watched it twice. The first time he felt a spark of anger. The second time he felt a cold, hard resolve settling in his gut like concrete. This wasn't just about a rude producer anymore. This was about a sickness in the heart of the world, a sickness that viewed human life as data. He handed the tablet back to Clara. His hand was steady. "Who posted it?" George asked quietly. "Sarah," Clara replied. "The daughter. She captioned it. 'This is the man who wanted to silence my father's last breath. This is the industry. Thank God for the cowboy.'" George looked back out the window. The lights of Dallas were beginning to appear on the horizon, a sprawling grid of amber and gold. "Is she okay?" George asked. Clara hesitated. "No. Tyler's team is already counterattacking. They have bots swarming her account. They are claiming she's an actress. They are claiming the death was a hoax staged by you to get out of the contract. They are tearing her apart, George. She just lost her father an hour ago, and now she has 10,000 strangers calling her a liar." George closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw tightened. The peace he sought at the ranch was dissolving before he even touched the ground. He had hoped the music was enough. He had hoped the gesture was enough. But evil doesn't sleep, and it certainly doesn't apologize. "Get me my lawyer on the phone," George said. "Not the entertainment lawyer. Get me the one who handles the land disputes, the one who fights the oil companies. I need a fighter, not a negotiator." Meanwhile, in a glass-walled conference room in Los Angeles, Tyler Vance was not sleeping. He was surrounded by a crisis management team, 5 people in sharp suits who specialized in burying the truth. The mood in the room was frantic, but calculated. Tyler was sweating, his tie discarded on the floor, his eyes bloodshot. "We can't delete the video," a PR specialist said, typing furiously on a laptop. "It's been shared 2 million times in an hour. It's on every platform." "The narrative is that you're a monster, Tyler." "I am not a monster," Tyler shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I am a producer. I was protecting the asset." George Strait breached his contract. He hijacked the feed. "That is theft of airtime." "We can spin that," a lawyer interjected, his voice smooth and reptilian. "We pivot. We claim that George Strait was mentally unstable. We claim that the glitch that allowed the comments through was actually a hack orchestrated by his team. We sue him for sabotage. And the girl?" Tyler looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What about the girl? If we can prove she's a fraud, or at least cast enough doubt, the public will turn," the lawyer said. "We release a statement saying we have evidence that the phone call was pre-recorded. We muddy the waters. We make the truth debatable. By the time the dust settles, you'll be the victim of a senile artist's publicity stunt." Tyler smiled. It was a cold, humorless smile. "Do it. Destroy them. Freeze George's royalties from the broadcast. Slap him with a $50 million lawsuit for defamation and breach of contract. And find dirt on that family in Nashville. If the father had so much as a parking ticket, I want it on the front page tomorrow." The sun was cresting over the Texas hills when George's truck crunched over the gravel driveway of his ranch. The sky was a brilliant, defiant blue, the color of hope, but George didn't feel it. He parked the truck and sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The silence here was different than the silence in the plane. It was alive. Birds, wind in the mesquite trees, the distant lowing of cattle. He stepped out, his boots hitting the dust. Norma was waiting on the porch. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She had been married to the man for 50 years. She knew the slope of his shoulders meant trouble. She knew the way he held his hat meant sorrow. She walked down the steps, wiped her hands on her apron, and wrapped her arms around him. George buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of flour and soap, the smell of home. He held her tighter than usual. "I'm tired, Norma," George whispered, his voice cracking. "I think I'm done. I think that was the last one." Norma pulled back and looked him in the eyes. She saw the pain. She saw the shadow of the death he had witnessed. "Come inside, George. Coffee's on. We'll talk about done later. Right now, you're just a man who needs breakfast." But the world wouldn't let him have breakfast. As he sat at his kitchen table, staring at a plate of eggs he couldn't eat, the landline phone on the wall rang. It was a harsh, jarring sound in the rustic kitchen. George ignored it. It rang again, and again. Norma picked it up. She listened for a moment, her face hardening. She hung up without saying goodbye. "Who was it?" George asked. "A reporter," Norma said, her voice icy. "Asking if it's true that you paid an actress to pretend her father died to boost your album sales." George stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. The veins in his neck bulged. The accusation was so vile, so detached from reality, that it made him dizzy. "They are saying that?" George asked, his voice low. Norma nodded. "It's on the news, George." Tyler Vance issued a statement. "He's suing you for $50 million. He's calling the whole thing a calculated hoax." George walked to the window. He looked out at his land. He had worked his whole life to build a name that meant something. He had never engaged in scandals. He had never sought attention. He just sang the songs. And now, a man in a suit was trying to turn his act of mercy into a lie. But it wasn't the money that bothered him. It was Sarah. He thought of that girl sitting alone in a hospital room, her father's body likely still warm, being bombarded by this hatred. George turned back to Norma. "I need the number," he said. "What number?" "The girl. Sarah. I need to call her." Norma didn't argue. She went to George's bag, pulled out the notepad where Clara had scribbled the contact info, and handed it to him. George dialed. His hands were large, scarred from ropes and reins, and they looked clumsy on the small keypad. It rang once. "Hello?" The voice was tiny, exhausted. It sounded like a ghost. "Sarah, it's George." There was a silence on the other end. Then, a broken sob. "Mr. Strait, please tell them to stop. I don't care about the money. I don't care about anything. They are saying my daddy didn't exist. They are posting pictures of his house and saying it's a set. I can't grieve him because I have to defend him." The pain in her voice tore through George's heart like a barbed wire fence. This was the collateral damage of a digital war, a regular person crushed by the machinery of fame. "Listen to me, Sarah," George said, his voice firm and commanding. "You turn off your phone, you turn off the TV, do you hear me? You disconnect." "I can't," she cried. "The funeral home," they called. "They said they are worried about security risks because of the controversy. They don't want to host the service, George. They are afraid of the press. I have nowhere to bury him." George's hand gripped the phone so tight the plastic creaked. The indignity of it. A veteran who fought for his country was being denied a funeral because a producer in LA wanted to save his stock price. "Where are you?" George asked. "I'm still at the hospital, waiting for the transport, but nobody is coming." George took a deep breath. He looked at Norma. She nodded. She knew what he was going to do before he did. "Sarah, you tell the hospital to keep him there for 4 hours." "What? Why?" "Because I'm coming to get him," George said. "Mr. Strait, you can't. You're in Texas." "I'm in Nashville. I have a plane, Sarah, and I have a ranch. If Tennessee won't bury a hero, Texas will." He hung up the phone. The decision was made. It wasn't a business decision. It was a cowboy decision. George looked at Norma. "Pack a bag," he said. "We're going to a funeral." "But you can't just bring a body across state lines like that, George," Norma said, though she was already untying her apron. "The legalities." "I don't care about the legalities," George snapped, then softened. "I'll pay the fines, I'll fight the lawsuits, but I am not leaving that man in a hospital basement while Tyler Vance plays games with his memory." George walked out to the porch. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed his lawyer, the shark he had asked for earlier. "Jim, it's George. George, I'm reading the lawsuit from Vance. It's ugly. They are freezing your accounts. They are—" "Shut up, Jim. Listen to me. I need you to meet me in Nashville in 3 hours. Bring the transport papers for a deceased veteran." "George, you can't be serious. If you intervene now, you are validating the lawsuit. You are making it personal." "It is personal," George roared, his voice echoing across the empty fields. "They are attacking a grieving girl, Jim. I want you to file a countersuit, but not for money. I want you to release the unedited audio from my in-ear monitors." There was a pause on the line. "You have that?" Jim asked. "I record every show," George said. "For quality control. I have the raw feed. I have Tyler Vance in my ear for the entire concert. I have him mocking the audience. I have him insulting the sponsors. And I have him telling me to ignore a dying man. That's nuclear, George. If we release that, Tyler Vance will never work again. But the network will blacklist you. You'll never play televised music again." George looked at the setting sun. He looked at his guitar leaning against the wall. He thought about the stadiums, the lights, the roar of the crowd. And then he thought about the silence on the other end of the phone when Sarah's father took his last breath. "I don't need to play on TV, Jim. I need to sleep at night. Release the tapes." George hung up. He walked back inside, grabbed his black suit jacket, the one he wore for church and funerals, and brushed the dust off the lapel. 2 hours later, the Gulf Stream was in the air again. But this time the mood was different. It wasn't a retreat. It was a rescue mission. When they landed in Nashville, the scene at the private hangar was a circus. Paparazzi swarmed the fence line. News helicopters circled overhead. The story had become a global phenomenon. The king of country versus the corporate machine. George stepped off the plane. He didn't hide. He didn't wear sunglasses. He walked straight to the waiting hearse that he had arranged. Sarah was standing there, looking small and fragile in the chaos. She ran to him. George didn't offer a handshake. He offered a hug that enveloped her. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into his chest. "I'm so sorry I dragged you into this." "You didn't drag me, darling," George said, guiding her into the back of the limousine. "You woke me up." They drove to the hospital. The loading dock was surrounded by cameras. Tyler Vance's influence was everywhere. He had tipped off the press, hoping to catch George doing something illegal, something undignified. But George Strait didn't do undignified. He walked into the hospital morgue. He signed the papers. He looked the administrators in the eye until they looked away in shame for trying to refuse the service. When they brought the casket out, a simple wooden box with an American flag draped over it, the paparazzi surged forward. Flashes popped like lightning. Questions were shouted. "Is it a hoax, George? How much did you pay her? Do you have a comment for Tyler Vance?" George stopped. He signaled the pallbearers, his own security team, to pause. He turned to the wall of cameras. The noise died down. Everyone wanted the soundbite. He looked straight into the lens of the nearest camera. "This man's name was Corporal Thomas Miller," George said, his voice cutting through the humid air. "He served in the 101st Airborne. He farmed the earth. He raised a daughter. He died holding her hand." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd of reporters. "If any of you print one more word calling his life a lie, if any of you harass this girl one more time, you won't be dealing with my lawyers. You'll be dealing with me. And I promise you, I have more time and more money than all of you combined." He turned back to the hearse. "We're going to Texas." The convoy moved out, but they didn't go unnoticed. As they drove toward the airport, something happened. The people of Nashville, the real people, not the industry executives, had heard the news. They lined the streets. Truck drivers pulled over and stood by their cabs, hats over their hearts. Mothers held up signs that said, "We stand with Sarah." Construction workers stopped their jackhammers. It wasn't a parade for a celebrity. It was a procession for a soldier led by a cowboy. Back in Los Angeles, Tyler Vance watched the live feed on his office wall. The nuclear tape of his voice in George's ear had just been leaked by George's lawyer. It was playing on every news channel. The internet was turning. The narrative was shifting violently. Tyler's phone began to ring. It was the CEO of the network. Tyler stared at the phone. He knew that if he picked it up, he was fired. He knew his career was over. But his ego wouldn't let him accept defeat. He picked up the phone. "I can fix this," Tyler screamed before the CEO could speak. "It's a deep fake. I'll sue them." "Tyler," the CEO's voice was cold. "You're done. Security is coming to escort you out." "And Tyler, George Strait just bought the controlling stake in the production company. He's your boss now, and he says you're fired." The line went dead. But the story wasn't over. The villain was defeated, yes, but the funeral still had to happen. And George had one more promise to keep. The plane landed in Texas at dusk. The casket was transported to the ranch. A grave had been dug under a massive oak tree, overlooking the valley where the sun set the longest. It was a private service. Just George, Norma, Sarah, and the local pastor. But as they lowered the casket into the ground, George heard a sound, a low rumble. He looked toward the horizon. Dust was rising. Headlights were cutting through the twilight. It wasn't the press. It wasn't lawyers. It was trucks, hundreds of them. Ford, Chevy, Dodge, old beat-up farm trucks and shiny new rigs, horse trailers, motorcycles. The people of Texas had heard that a veteran was being buried on the Strait Ranch. They had heard that the world tried to erase him. They came to pay their respects. They parked along the fence line, miles of chrome and steel. They didn't try to enter the property. They just stood by their trucks. And then, one of them turned on their radio. Then another. Then another. They were all tuned to the same station, and the station was playing "The Cowboy Rides Away." The music drifted across the fields, a ghostly choir of 1,000 car stereos. Sarah looked at George, tears streaming down her face. "Did you do this?" she asked. George shook his head, tears in his own eyes. "No, ma'am. That's just country music." He took his guitar out of the case. He stood by the open grave. "I didn't get to finish the song for him properly," George said. He strummed the chord. "I ain't got no excuses. I just want to say—" He sang the rest of the song, accompanied by the wind and the distant echo of the radios. When it was over, Sarah threw a handful of dirt onto the casket. "Goodbye, Daddy," she whispered. George put his arm around her. "You're family now, Sarah. You understand? You ain't alone." But as the peace of the moment settled, George's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again, a persistent, urgent rhythm. He sighed and pulled it out, intending to turn it off. It was a text from his lawyer, Jim. "George, don't get comfortable. The network fired Tyler, but he's not gone. He just leaked the medical records of the father. He's claiming the man died of an overdose, not the illness. He's trying to get the body exhumed for an autopsy to prove fraud. The police are on their way to the ranch with a warrant. George stared at the phone. The sun had set. The darkness was back. He looked at the fresh grave. He looked at Sarah, who was finally finding a moment of peace. He looked at the gate of his ranch, where flashing red and blue lights were just beginning to appear in the distance, cutting through the line of respectful trucks. They weren't going to let him rest. They were coming for the body. George handed the guitar to Norma. He walked to his truck and pulled out a lever-action rifle. He didn't load it. He didn't intend to shoot, but he intended to draw a line in the sand. He walked to the front gate, standing alone in the headlights of the approaching police cruisers. "This ends tonight," George whispered to the Texas wind. The red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruisers strobed against the weathered oak of the ranch gate, creating a chaotic disco effect that clashed violently with the solemnity of the Texas night. The siren wails had died down, replaced by the crackle of police radios and the idling of engines. Sheriff deeply respected George, but the law was a cold, unfeeling machine, and right now the machine was demanding entry. George Strait stood in the center of the gravel road. He held the lever-action Winchester across his chest, barrel pointed at the sky, his finger nowhere near the trigger. He wasn't a threat. He was a barrier. He was the line where the madness of the modern world had to stop. Behind him lay the fresh grave of a soldier. In front of him stood the state of Texas. Sheriff Brody stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was a big man, hat in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He walked slowly toward the gate, stopping 10 feet from George. "George, put the rifle away," Brody said, his voice pleading. "Don't make this what it ain't." "I ain't making it anything, Brody," George replied, his voice calm, carrying over the hum of the engines. "I'm just standing on my land. I have a warrant, George. A judge signed it 20 minutes ago. The allegations, they're serious. They say the death was assisted. They say it was an overdose. We have to take the body for an autopsy." George didn't flinch. He looked at the paper in Brody's hand as if it were a poisonous snake. "It was cancer, Brody. The man had glioblastoma. The overdose Tyler Vance is screaming about was morphine, palliative care. The doctor prescribed it to ease his passing. You know that. I know that." "It doesn't matter what I know," the sheriff sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "It matters what the paper says. If I don't execute this warrant, the state police will come, and they won't ask nicely. Please, George, step aside. Let us do the job, prove the lie, and put him back to rest." George shook his head slowly. "If you dig him up, you desecrate him. You turn a hero into evidence. You let that snake in Los Angeles win. You let him turn a moment of peace into a crime scene." George took a half step forward. "You're not digging him up, Brody. Not tonight, not ever." The tension was a physical weight. The deputies by the cars had their hands on their holsters, unsure of what to do. This was George Strait. You don't arrest the king, but you don't ignore a judge. Then the dynamic shifted. From the darkness behind the police line, a sound emerged, the heavy metallic clank of a door opening, then another, then 50 more. The wall of trucks that had lined the road, the fans, the neighbors, the Texans who had come to pay respects, began to move, but they didn't drive. The drivers stepped out. They walked past the police cars. They walked through the ditch. They walked onto the road, filling the gap between the sheriff and George. It wasn't a mob, it was a community. There were old men in overalls, young cowboys in muddy boots, women holding babies. They didn't shout. They didn't hold weapons. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, forming a human wall 5 people deep in front of the gate. Sheriff Brody looked around, bewildered. He saw the face of his high school football coach in the crowd. He saw the lady who ran the diner. He saw his own cousin. "Go home, folks," Brody shouted, though his heart wasn't in it. "This is police business. It's family business, Sheriff," a voice called out from the back. "And in Texas, we don't dig up veterans." George lowered the rifle. He looked at the wall of people protecting him. He felt a lump in his throat that no song could ever describe. He walked up to the gate, opened it, and stepped through, standing right next to Sheriff Brody. He put a hand on the sheriff's shoulder. "Look at them, Brody. You gonna arrest the whole county? You gonna handcuff the people who voted for you?" Brody looked at the crowd. He looked at the warrant in his hand. He looked at George's eyes, which held a fierce, quiet intelligence. "Tyler Vance thinks he can use the law as a weapon," George said softly, "but the law is supposed to serve the people. These are the people." Brody looked down at the ground. He swore under his breath. Then he looked up at his deputies. "Put the radios away," Brody ordered. "But Sheriff, the warrant," a deputy started. I said put 'em away, Brody barked. He turned back to George. He took the warrant, folded it into a tiny square, and shoved it into his pocket. I'm going to tell the judge the gate was obstructed by a civil disturbance, and we couldn't gain entry without inciting a riot, Brody said. I'm going to tell him we need to verify the medical records with the hospital before we try again. That should buy you 24 hours. That's all I need, George said. Brody tipped his hat. Give my regards to Miss Sarah. Tell her I'm sorry about her daddy. The police cars reversed. The lights faded. The sheriff drove away, choosing his soul over his orders. The crowd cheered, a low, respectful roar. George raised his hand to thank them, but he didn't linger. He had 24 hours to kill the lie before it came back with a SWAT team. He turned and walked back toward the ranch house. Norma was waiting on the porch with Sarah. Sarah was pale, shaking, holding a cup of tea with both hands. Did they go? Sarah asked. For now, George said. He walked past them, straight into his study. Jim, his lawyer, was already there, surrounded by paperwork spread out on George's mahogany desk. He looked exhausted. We have a problem, George, Jim said, rubbing his temples. The narrative is sticking. The overdose headline is trending. The hospital is clamming up because of HIPAA laws. They won't release the official cause of death to the public to refute Vance. George sat down. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at the wall, where a gold record for Pure Country hung. We don't need the hospital, George said. We need the source. What do you mean? Tyler Vance leaked the records, George said, which means he stole them, which means he hacked a federal database or bribed a doctor. That's a felony, Jim. Jim nodded slowly. Yes, but proving it takes time. We need a forensic audit of... We don't have time for audits, George interrupted. Hand me the phone. Who are you calling? I'm calling the one person Tyler Vance fears more than the police. I'm calling the money. George dialed a number from memory. It was a number few people had. It belonged to Elias Thorne, the octogenarian media mogul who owned the parent company of the network, the record label, and effectively, Tyler Vance's career. Elias was a man of the old school, a man who shook hands. The phone rang 4 times. George? Elias's voice was raspy, like dry leaves. It's late. It's about to get later, Elias, George said. I've seen the news, George. It's a mess. Vance is a liability, but he's making us money. The ratings for that disaster of a concert are through the roof. Controversy sells. Honor sells longer, Elias, George said, cutting him off. Listen to me closely. I have the unedited audio of the show, you know that. But here is what you don't know. My team is currently uploading a file to the FBI Cybercrimes Division. It contains proof that your production company accessed confidential VA medical records without a warrant. There was silence on the other end of the line. Accessing VA records was a federal crime. It carried prison time. It would dissolve the company's insurance. You're bluffing, Elias whispered. Am I? George asked. Do I look like a man who bluffs? You know me, Elias. I don't play poker, I play the guitar, and right now I'm holding a match to your entire empire. What do you want, George? I want a retraction. A full televised apology. I want the medical examiner's report released by the family's consent, unredacted showing the cancer. And I want Tyler Vance. You want him fired? No, George said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. I want him erased. I want him to have 0 severance. I want you to sue him for the breach of data. I want him to walk out of that building with nothing but the shirt on his back. And if I do this, then I don't release the FBI file, and I sign a 3-album extension with your label. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. It was the sound of billions of dollars moving on a chessboard. Done, Elias said. George hung up. He looked at Jim. Draft the consent form for Sarah to sign. Release the medical records. The next morning, the world woke up to the truth. The morning shows didn't open with scandal. They opened with a somber medical examiner reading a report. Cause of death: terminal glioblastoma. Toxicology: consistent with prescribed palliative care. Then the screens cut to a breaking news alert. Tyler Vance was shown being escorted out of the network building by federal agents. He wasn't screaming this time. He was in handcuffs. The network had thrown him to the wolves to save themselves, just as George knew they would. He was facing charges for wire fraud, data theft, and hacking federal databases. The overdose lie evaporated like mist in the Texas sun. George stood on the porch, drinking coffee. The police cars were gone. The trucks were gone. The silence had returned. Sarah walked out. She looked different. The weight was gone from her shoulders. She looked at the fresh mound of earth under the oak tree. "It's over?" she asked. "The noise is over," George said. "The grieving can start now." She nodded, wiping a tear. "I don't know how to thank you. I have nothing to give you. My daddy's farm, the bank is taking it next week. I'm going back to nothing." George set his coffee cup down on the railing. He looked out at his pastures, at the horses grazing in the golden light. "You ain't going back to nothing, Sarah." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a deed. "I made a call to the bank in Nashville this morning," George said casually. "Turns out they were pretty eager to sell that note to me. Bad PR to foreclose on a hero, you see." Sarah stared at him, her mouth opening slightly. You bought the mortgage?" "I paid it off," George corrected. "It's yours, free and clear. Every acre, every fence post." Sarah fell to her knees. She didn't have words. She just wept, covering her face with her hands. "But there's a condition," George said, stepping down and helping her up. "Anything," she sobbed. "You fix the fences, you keep the land, and once a year on the anniversary you play that song for him. Loud." "I promise," she whispered. George smiled. It was the first real smile he had smiled in 2 days. Epilogue, 6 months later. The Neon Arena in Las Vegas was sold out again. The lights were blinding. The crowd was deafening. But something was different. There were no tablets on the stage. There were no scrolling feeds of social media comments. There were no producers screaming in headsets about demographics. The stage was simple. Just a band, some instruments, and a man in a hat. George Strait walked up to the microphone. The applause lasted for 5 minutes. He didn't rush it. He let it wash over him, a wave of genuine love, not algorithm-generated engagement. He adjusted the mic stand. "We ain't gonna do much talking tonight," George said, his voice familiar and warm. "We're just gonna play some music." He looked at the front row. There was an empty seat there, draped with an American flag. It was permanently reserved, and he looked at the wings of the stage. Standing there, holding a clipboard, working as part of the tour management team, was Sarah. She looked happy. She looked strong. She gave him a thumbs up. George nodded. He turned to the band. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fiddle kicked in. The steel guitar wept, and George Strait began to sing. He sang about love. He sang about rodeos. He sang about Amarillo and oceanfront property. But when he got to the encore, the arena went silent without him asking. They knew what was coming. George didn't play The Cowboy Rides Away. Not tonight. That song belonged to Thomas Miller now. Instead, he played a new song, a song he had written on the porch, watching the sun go down over a quiet grave. The world moves fast on a screen of glass, but truth is found in the green of the grass. You can't buy a soul with a dollar sign, and you can't break a heart that's towing the line. As the final chord faded, George took off his hat. He waved to the crowd. He waved to Sarah. He walked off the stage, down the tunnel, past the cheering crew. He walked straight to the exit door and pushed it open. The cool desert night hit his face. His truck was waiting. He got in, started the engine, and didn't look back at the neon lights. He just drove. Because the king of country knew the truth. The show isn't the life, the applause isn't the reward. The reward is the silence after the right thing has been done. And as he drove into the dark, George Strait smiled, turned on the radio and just listened to the static, the most beautiful sound in the world.